Welcome to another episode of Heard on West Exec, the podcast that discusses everything you need to know about working in the executive branch of the federal government. Heard on West Exec is a podcast produced by the American Cornerstone Institute as part of the Executive Branch for America, or EBA, program. EBA was created for college students, congressional staffers, and working professionals to serve in the executive branch. I joined the executive branch after a 40-year career in the private sector, and this would have been very helpful to me to get acclimated from day one. You can find the EBA program on eba.americancornerstone.org. It offers a web-based training and self-certification series with detailed information about all aspects of the executive branch, including understanding the executive office of the president, understanding the federal budget and spending process, understanding the rulemaking process, and much more. EBA program was created by people who served in past administrations. This podcast is designed to talk to those who have served in order to educate us on what they learned, what to avoid, and what they wish they had known going in. Through EBA, you will get an insider understanding of the vast and winding maze of the executive branch of the federal government. You'll learn what it takes to succeed and hit the ground running on your first day in the federal government. Please enjoy today's video, and you can find more videos on the EBA website. Again, eba.americancornerstone.org, that feature prominent names such as Kellyanne Conway, Brian Jack, Russ Foy, and of course Dr. Ben Carson. Please visit the website, sign up for the courses, continue to listen to this weekly podcast, Heard on West Exec, and continue to get great information on working in the executive branch of the federal government. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. We also love hearing your comments and feedback to the podcast, so please rate us and review us on whatever platform you receive the podcast. Enjoy the episode, and thank you for joining us.
Brian, tell us a little bit. You've had kind of a pretty wide variety of different roles in government and public service. Tell me a little bit about what you were doing at the White House and what that meant, what that looked like, sure, and also what you're doing now.
Well, thank you very much. So I, like you, I was in the 2016 campaign. I worked for Ben Carson on his campaign, and as soon as that campaign ended, I joined the Trump campaign in March 2016 as his delegate director. And I say that because I think the experience I had there prepared me for the job I had at the White House, but I was responsible for going around the country to all these state conventions to ensure that the delegates that went to the national convention voted for the president. Obviously, the president won the nomination there. And thereafter, I met Bill Stepien, who was my boss on the campaign, and I was a regional political director, so again, very political in nature. And as soon as the campaign ended, joined the transition and was privileged, like you, to start at the White House on day one. I was a deputy White House political director for the first 2 years, and then I became the White House political director just after. And it's a really interesting office. The Office of Political Affairs was started in 1981, and it's actually very similar to the circumstances by which the office began, because President Reagan came in as kind of the upset, and no one thought that he was going to win in 1980, at least the Republican nomination. And Lynn Nofziger, who actually was supposed to be the first Reagan press secretary, turned it down for political director, but he encouraged and convinced the president to create this office that maintain relationships with not just Capitol Hill, like Legislative Affairs does, but also to maintain relationships with the party. And how can you do that in a compliant way? Became a very tricky thing to navigate over the time of it, but it was an awesome office to be a part of, and it has flourished in Republican and Democrat administration. So I was Deputy White House Political Director the first 2 years, and then White House Political Director.
How did you get your first start into politics? What was the very first job you had?
Sure.
Because you don't get to just start off as a Deputy White House Political
Sure.
Director. I mean, I know you were on the campaign before, but what was the first thing you did to kind of get your foot in the door?
My first job after college, my cousin was interning at the RNC, and I had just finished school, and I too, I'd interned on Capitol Hill and such, but he was at the RNC. I reached out to him, got an internship along with him, and then there I got hired. From the RNC, I went to AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, for 4 years, and while there, my job was to know everything about every congressional race in the country. And it was a cool job because it wasn't just Republican races we focused on, it was also Democrat races. So I learned a lot about the Democrat political environment. I can only imagine what it's like studying those races now today and the depth that I did. But from there, I got lucky. I reached out to Ben Carson's campaign just blindly, offered to help on ballot access, which having run a presidential campaign.
It's one of the hardest parts of running for president that most people have no idea even exists.
And if you get all 56 right, you get a pat on the back. If you miss one,
you're in big trouble.
Exactly. And I say 56 because there's territories and such. Right. But nonetheless, I got that job on the Carson campaign, responsible for putting him on the ballot everywhere. And through that, I got a chance to work with some folks you may not know, but Molly Michael sat across from me on the Carson campaign. So Molly and I shared a desk, and then Andrew Hughes was one of my best friends, who of course was a really good chief of staff for Dr. Carson and works with ACI, leading it now. But nonetheless, so you got some good people. Will Russell started on that campaign too. So a lot of Carson alumni moved over to the president's campaign after his campaign ended, and then I think through my experience on the president's campaign, I was able to get that job in the White House.
Yeah, one thing in talking to a lot of different people who have worked in the administration, and just knowing some other people's stories, so many people's start begins on either interning or volunteering or working at the lowest levels on a campaign and working their way up. I always tell young people that are interested in politics, they're like, how do I become the White House press secretary, or how do I do this? I'm like, I never set out for that job, but I found candidates I believed in. I went out, I volunteered, I worked, and then you find yourself, one day at the White House. And that seems to be quite a common thread. If you had advice to pass on to young people about the best way to engage and get a start in public service, what advice would you give?
I agree with that. I agree with that completely. I think of one of our colleagues, Shahira Knight, who was a great legislative affairs director, and there are, I think, in my opinion, two paths. One, you can go the political route, which I just described for me. She was the expert on tax policy. She was unrivaled on Capitol Hill, was the smartest person in the room when it came to tax policy. The timing was perfect for her because, of course, the president's signature legislative accomplishment those first 2 years was the Tax Reform Act. And, she too, that's a path that also works, is become an absolute expert in your field, and you will be called upon to serve at the highest level. So I think that's the one path, is to go the policy route, or the political route, which is kind of like a startup, right? You take a chance, you join something, you're a part of something, and then you get to see that grow. So I feel like there's always two routes, and I always use her as an example just because, as you know, she was a real expert in her field, and that propelled her to where she got.
In your role as political director, you're always kind of dealing with the ebbs and flows of the political environment, and different challenges that come with that. But internally, there's a lot of challenges too. You're making sure individuals are compliant when they engage in political activity. There's something called the Hatch Act that federal employees have to follow. Can you walk us through what some of both the guardrails, but also some of the difficulties of navigating being the political director, which is probably one of the hardest jobs to maintain all the compliance issues while still being productive in the role that you have.
Absolutely.
At the White House.
So you mentioned the Hatch Act. So this law was created in 1939, and if you ever read about the FDR administration, they so politicized that thing. And they were effectively, in order to work in the administration, you had to do Democrat activities, get out the vote efforts. It started in the 38 midterms. They created this act, and it effectively regulates, and understandably so, they don't want the American taxpayer paying for political activity. So as a result, there have been numerous White Houses that have developed a process by which administration officials, whether it be yourself as White House press secretary or Secretary Carson over at HUD, how can they participate in their First Amendment right to be politically active, but at the same time ensure their compliance? And we created a process called the Blue Sheet process. And you hear about blue slips in the Senate. It's different than that, but blue sheets effectively were an internal checklist that enabled you or Secretary Carson to say, I want to participate in this county Republican event. How can I do that? Well, we can't use your title and we can't use government resources. The invitation that's sent out cannot suggest that you are soliciting money for government activity or anything to that effect. So we've got to approve your invitation, make sure any public materials are consistent and compliant with the Hatch Act and federal law. And then likewise ensure that the political committees are the ones responsible for paying you to come. It's your First Amendment right. It's all of our First Amendment rights to exercise our political activism, but you got to make sure you do it compliantly. And I'm proud to say, our White House had very few Hatch Act complaints as it related to political travel. And I think in large part it's because we were really buttoned up on it. And, I noticed that your successor was at the podium campaigning for Glenn Youngkin's opponent just last year. So you don't see it's a little hypocritical on their side, but we've done a much better job than we got credit for.
Yeah, I would never have survived a moment like that without a number of Hatch Act violations filed against
Crew
me.
would have had a crew outside your house. Yeah.
Absolutely. In the role as political director for the White House, you kind of serve in many ways as a liaison between the president and the RNC, as well as virtually every campaign.
Right.
And even current office holder. How do you navigate that's a lot of personalities, and trying to kind of bring all those different things together and function.
Sure.
What was the most difficult part of that role of bringing so many different kind of components and people to the table?
Well, I think first and foremost, right, check your ego at the door. It's totally fine. We work in politics, so everyone's, got big positions, so always just be kind and thoughtful. But I think for me, my experience that I had at AIPAC really helped prepare me for the role because, again, studying congressional races, knowing everything there is to know about the specific race or House race or Senate race or governor race, enables you to understand from where they're coming. So maybe candidate X needs this type of support. Candidate Y may not want to engage in this type of area. Understanding that makes it a lot easier to, I think, navigate those personalities. And then likewise, I would say, good relationships on Capitol Hill. I had a chance to work closely for my current boss, Leader McCarthy. Leader McCarthy was an outstanding partner for us, and if I can just take a moment to show how engaged the president was. It's often underreported. We kept it very quiet, but from Labor Day 2020 to Election Day 2020, President Trump participated in 56 telerallies for congressional candidates during the height of his own campaign. And there were Sunday nights where I remember from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. every 10 minutes we would do telerallies. All compliant, all consistent with federal law, but it enabled him to go out and campaign for the ticket like he was proud to do. And you can see today, he's very proud of his endorsement record and the prowess, and it shows the results speak for themselves. We took back the House, or came close to taking back the House, picking up 15 seats that no one thought we could.
In your experience, are most White Houses as engaged in the political process as the president was? I mean, he was very active in the midterms as well. I mean, he went out and did quite a few rallies, pretty aggressive endorsement, and also not only engaged, but did it matter as much? I mean, it felt like, and still even to this day, with him not in office, his endorsement still matters, where I think a lot of times previously, endorsements don't have as much of an impact. How much did that change the dynamic in what you were doing in your office, his personal level of engagement?
Well, just to show you a contrast, Joe Biden has endorsed 2 people this election cycle, and he's 1-1, 50% election record. President Trump, when he was in 2020, endorsed 122 candidates with a 120/2 win-loss record. So just to show you a juxtaposition there, I think politically with the president, I think that he is just again, I think it's underreported, but I think he is a real political savant, understands congressional politics a lot better than people give him credit for. And I think that he wants to leave he wants to enable people that are supportive of him to likewise leverage his support for them. And as a result, that whole concept of a telerally was created. It's a funny story, but we were sitting there at the height of COVID. He wanted to figure out a way to still campaign for not just himself, but also other people. And he said, well, why don't I just, modify a teletown hall to make it a tele-rally where I'm delivering remarks, and it's, and as a result, like I said, we ended up doing 56 of them. So I think that it's very different than what the current White House is doing. And even if you go back to the Obama administration, I think in 2010, he was not as prevalent on the campaign trail, and certainly not in 2012 for congressional candidates.
No. How much did the policy initiatives that the White House was focused on drive the politics? How much did that impact what you guys were doing in your office every day?
Well, I found, and I mean, frankly, we were kind of a quiet office behind the scenes, but all those official trips were run through our office in advance. The advance office, of course, produces the event. But I found when we as a White House were really attacking a policy, shouldn't say attacking, but we were approaching a policy and trying to move forward an agenda. When it was one issue, like tax reform, it gave us the roadmap and the blueprint for us to go around the country. You may remember, you were serving as White House press secretary at the time, all of those roundtables we would host and all those stories our office would find, those inspirational stories of people that got a tax break or a tax cut. That was such a gratifying thing because we were able to go community to community to community and build these events. And the president, as we both know, there's no better person, interpersonal communicator than him. So putting those environments together made for a very special time. And I found, as it relates to policy, whether it was infrastructure, we did an event, we had a long thing with federal bureaucracy and how convoluted it is, and UPS was there. Anytime we could create that visual, that's what we tried to do. And I found that when we, as a White House, were really pursuing a policy agenda, it made the politics that much easier to follow.
It also felt like when we were very focused on a policy agenda, all the components of the White House seemed to be at our best.
Yeah.
And people were collaborating and working together in a much better way, cohesive way. And you could feel the difference in those moments. We've talked about a lot of the challenges and some of the difficult parts, and even touched on very briefly some of the good parts. What's the most rewarding part of the job that you had in the White House?
I think it's funny. There's an adage, the best and worst thing about politics are the people. And it's kind of true, but I think that at the end of the day, we had a great office, the Office of Political Affairs. We had no turnover in the 2 years that I led it. And just the people that you get to meet, the opportunities, the experience. When you work at the White House and you know this better than anybody, everyone will return your phone call. It's probably the only job you can have where you can get in touch with anybody. And I think that was special to see. I also think for the president, for me, I got to see that very narrow thing. How involved was he with those congressional races? And I know it sounds like a narrow thing, but showing a guy that's in the middle of his own presidential campaign, that's calling me up, during when he was at Walter Reed saying, I need more calls, I need to do more calls, just seeing that hunger to help other people out was a really special thing for me to see. And obviously it was rewarding to see on election night the House take back 15 seats that nobody thought they could, except President Trump.